I want to shift focus a little bit and talk some about the organization, about the ACLU. I think sometimes about this kind of cheesy Aaron Sorkin movie called The American President, right? Maybe you've seen the movie. Anyway, Richard Dreyfuss plays a Republican senator who's running for president, and he's running against the incumbent, a Democrat played by Michael Douglas. He's pounding him on the campaign trail by calling him a, quote, card-carrying member of the ACLU, as if that's some sort of a cudgel or a dirty word or a dirty phrase. At the end of the movie, Douglas's character makes a speech in which he cops to the allegation. He is a member of the ACLU, and he turns it back on Dreyfuss and says, "Why aren't you a member of an organization whose sole purpose is to defend the Bill of Rights?" So I want to ask Peter, is that still the ACLU's sole purpose, to defend the Bill of Rights?
No, I mean, well, yes, of course. At the end of the day, we use the Bill of Rights as the tool to achieve an advancement of justice, liberty, and equity in the state of New Mexico. That is how we describe our mission. But the Bill of Rights isn't the end, isn't the final product that we're after, right? Like, that is the tool to try to achieve a better society in the long term. I think that historically the organization has seen, in fact, for a long time, sort of a advertising logo or a motto was that the Bill of Rights is the ACLU's client. Like, the client, we see the Bill of Rights as our client. I think these days we're probably a little more worldly in the way we view the importance of the Bill of Rights. It's an imperfect instrument, to be sure, to try to advocate for justice and equity and liberty, but it's a tool that doesn't exist in many countries, and it's an incredible tool to try to achieve those outcomes. So, First Amendment, free speech, religious liberty, religious establishment, like, those are all our bread and butter issues still now, as they always have been over the more than 100-year history of the organization. But I would also say that we carry out that mission more and more with an eye to what are the real needs of our community, and particularly the needs of communities that have been historically disenfranchised, communities that have traditionally not really had the opportunity to even enjoy the realities of or the promises of our Bill of Rights.
That's another good segue. I want to ask, in the quarter of a century that you've been doing this work, how have the organization's resources, challenges, and priorities changed?
Boy, a big question. The organization I'll start here, the organization has grown dramatically. We have had the good fortune, we live in a small state population-wise. We live in a resource-poor state, and nevertheless, we have a community of supporters in the state of New Mexico that I would put up against any other community in the country. And it's because of their generosity, because of their passion for justice, that we have been able to build an organization that is a true powerhouse, even compared to most other affiliates in states of our size or even larger around the country. We've grown from an organization of roughly 3 or 4 staff when I started to an organization of over 30 staff. We have 8, 9, 10 lawyers on staff who are currently carrying out 30 or 40 different legal actions, some of them very consequential with systemic impact, some of them that are going to have dramatic impact just for a sole family who maybe lost a loved one to police violence. So the capacity of the organization has just increased exponentially, and I just have to say personally, it's so rewarding to have seen that growth and to have helped that growth happen, because I know what it means for our state. Priority-wise, many of the priorities have remained the same. Like, New Mexico has always been a welcoming place for people to receive reproductive health care, particularly compared to the states that were sandwiched between Arizona and Texas. And that is more true now than it ever has been probably in our history. We've been a place that's been generally more welcoming to immigrant families than the states that surround us. And yet we still see major conflicts there. We have to fight for those rights each and every day. Like, civil liberties are never won. Those battles are fought and refought again and again. So our priorities have remained relatively constant over time, I would say. The only other one between, immigrant rights, again, protecting access to abortion care and other reproductive health care. Certainly the fact that we here in New Mexico have an unusually large percentage of our population that's incarcerated, and that phenomenon mostly affects people of color, particularly indigenous folks, black people. They tend to make up the larger, disproportionate number of folks serving time compared to what their population is out in the community. So that continues to be one of our priorities, and making sure that our correction system is not just an industry of abuse to people that are incarcerated. We have, in some cases, very horrendous conditions in our prisons, and trying to protect people as much as we can. We can't do everything we would want to do because the abuses are so rife, but we do what we can. So those remain key priorities. The one place where I think our priorities have really changed and shifted has been in the area of indigenous justice. I'm sort of sad to say that historically we as a state ACLU affiliate have not done everything that we might have done over the years on behalf of indigenous communities. And for roughly the last 6 years now, we have been really more committed to that cause. That's a trend happening nationally, by the way, and we happen to be on the forefront of that trend within the National ACLU. But I'm very happy to say that we are now really trying to find ways to add as much value to the efforts that are already going on the ground. We're not going to lead those efforts, but we are going to be as supportive as possible. And I can certainly cite examples of some of the work we've done there.
I'd like to return for just a moment to the First Amendment. Obviously, I don't get to do the work that I've done for the last 22 years in New Mexico without that. The ACLU historically has been the bastion of the protection of free speech, free expression. The ACLU represented Nazis in Skokie in the 70s, their free speech rights. And I could cite a million other examples just like that one. But the one from more recent memory that really sticks out for me was in 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, when the ACLU helped essentially a group of white supremacists get a permit to hold that rally, and of course, a young woman was killed. I wonder, was the organization chastened by the events of that day in 2017?
I wouldn't say chastened. I don't think that's the right adjective. I would say that it definitely generated quite a bit of debate within the organization. And keep in mind that over that very time, the organization nationally and within our own affiliate was becoming much more diverse, racially and otherwise. And so questions like that resound differently through an organization that is, where you have a large proportion, even 50% or more of staff who are people of color. Like I think they feel those questions more intimately than some of the traditional leaders of the organization. And so it has generated a fair amount of debate within the organization. It's caused us as a state affiliate to step back and sort of reflect on how would we respond in a similar moment, and to create some specific criteria for deciding how would we react to a moment like that. In what cases would we actually weigh in on behalf of a group of a group that was promulgating hate speech, and to the detriment of communities that we traditionally want to be helping as much as possible, that we want to be allies with. And I think we're much better situated to respond to one of those moments. We haven't had those moments in recent history that I can remember. But I think there are a number of things that need to be taken into consideration. Like, is this a group that has a history of violence? And do we want to be working directly with groups that are actually threatening violence, even while they're exercising their First Amendment rights? Are these groups, is the question at hand one that is going to create some sort of important precedent as it concerns First Amendment rights in our courts? Is this a group that can get its own legal counsel and has perfectly, the resources necessary to do that?
Doesn't need your help, essentially.
Exactly, doesn't need our help. And so those are the questions that we would consider in making a decision in those kinds of instances. So I should also say, the national office makes its decisions about moments like that and questions that come up. And it's a national organization, and it's situated a little differently than we here on the ground, who have a responsibility to the communities that surround us, to the communities that we're frankly a part of. And so I think it also lands with us a little differently when those moments come up.
Are you comfortable with the process that's in place now for vetting, screening, figuring out, we want to get in there on this one we're going to take a pass on? Sounds like there was a lot of internal soul searching, for lack of a better cliche. But are you comfortable with the process that's in place now to make those decisions?
Yeah, I feel really good about it. We had a very thoughtful conversation among board and staff that actually resulted in a formal policy and set of criteria that would be considered in that kind of a moment. And so I think we're really set up pretty well for responding to a situation like that and making a good decision, whether that be to go ahead and represent a particular group or to not.
Another shift that I feel like I have observed at the ACLU in recent years, I think we've been here for 25 minutes or so and we haven't talked about Donald Trump yet. I'm sure we'll get there. But one thing a shift that I have noticed, in addition to the civil liberties and civil rights work, it seems to me that the ACLU has also added the defense of democracy to y'all's docket. Do I have that right?
Well, we've always been strongly committed to protecting access to the franchise. Obviously, it's a key amendment of the Constitution. We've done, here in the state of New Mexico, we've collaborated with our other allies, Common Cause, Native American Education Voting Right, NAVA. The work that we've typically done, we've not typically led on those efforts, but we have supported in those efforts. And given that sort of, I think our bailiwick in the community tends to be sort of on the legal end, and so when we've been able to provide legal support for election protection, that's kind of where we found our niche. Certainly nationally, we've always had a voting rights project. They've been involved in some of the very most important cases that have determined sort of the contours of voting rights in the country. And so I wouldn't say it's a new place for us to be, but certainly it's a growing area. And given all the assaults on voting rights, the demands for voter ID, and then efforts to try to roll back the Voting Rights Act, naturally we found ourselves moving more and more into those spaces. Here in the state of New Mexico, we challenged the Albuquerque voter ID law right out of the gate. And when those moments come up, we'll definitely be there to respond.
As we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, significant freedoms have been lost, whether that's Roe versus Wade, environmental protections, or a number of other things that you could think of. What I'm curious about is, what can people who are watching this do to defend their own civil rights and liberties and everybody else's?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask this question, and so I've given it some thought. As I'm thinking about the coming year, the elections, I'm thinking a lot about our need to, as an organization, step back and take a moment to think, how are we going to prepare ourselves for what may come in a second Trump presidency? And one of the things that I think concerns me is, I hear it in the voices of members, I hear it in the voices of some of our financial supporters, a kind of level of exasperation and even despair that worries me, that we could see folks, instead of really stepping up and responding to the moment, pull back and sort of disassociate from the political realm, stop reading the news, protect themselves from that. And that's a legitimate response. I think it's an understandable response, at least. But at the same time, I think we have to understand that a Trump presidency, despite the Supreme Court rulings, despite the media predictions, is not going to be a totalizing presidency. It is not going to, I don't think it will spell the end of democracy, as many people are kind of predicting these days. But it is going to require us to, as a community, as communities around this country, to step up and participate in the same way that we did back during the first Trump presidency. And that's going to mean speaking out. It's going to mean locking in, joining into other groups, whether that means speaking out in social media, writing letters to your newspaper, whether it means getting involved in an indivisible group or starting an indivisible group or becoming part of another organization that's doing work that you support in a particular area. Joining the ACLU of New Mexico, I would encourage folks to go to our website and sign up to be a volunteer. We will be out and trying to recruit as many people as possible in the event that we see another Trump presidency. We're already trying to figure out what it would look like for us to respond to various specific sorts of threats here in the state. And we're going to need everybody back behind us and out on the streets protesting, whatever it may take. But I think that's the way, I don't think that there is some new glamorous, glittering approach to how we do this. I think it's we react the way we did in the last Trump presidency. And keep in mind that, like Trump obviously would be in office with Supreme Court rulings that are going to give him more expansive authority than what he's had in the past. It does appear. But at the same time, I think we have to remember, like during the first term, like all the efforts that he made to try to reconstruct government, to try to oppress the immigrant communities, like those were all contested outcomes at the end of the day. You think about like the family separation policy, you think about the Muslim ban, you think about the border wall. Like all of those efforts were at least weakened, if not delayed, if not stopped in their tracks. And that was because people rose to the moment. Organizations like the ACLU rose to the moment. And we'll have to do that again. I think that folks sometimes, like if it's not the sort of the glamorous work of expanding civil rights, expanding civil liberties, we forget the importance of just holding the line and protecting what currently exists in the country. We may lose some ground under a new Trump presidency, but at the same time, the things that we are able to continue to protect are going to be critical to keeping this country to be what it has been over, multiple centuries now. Things like freedom of the press, things like a representative form of government. Like those are the things we are going to be fighting for, and they are going to be critical because to have those things put on the chopping block, all of our lives will change qualitatively. And so it is worth stepping up and putting out the energy again, just the way we did under that first Trump presidency.
Right now, most of that stuff is still standing. I think I generally agree with what you said. There was a hollowing out, certainly, and all sorts of other horrors, but the institutions, by and large, survived. In any case, Peter Simonson, Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of New Mexico, thank you so much for the chat.
Thank you.